And now today's featured speaker is Senior Lecturer Liz LeDoux. Liz LeDoux is a Senior Lecturer in Bentley's English and Media Studies Department. Her teaching and research interests include film and audio production techniques, narrative concepts in media, and experimental film and television. She currently serves as coordinator of the Media and Culture major and director of Media and Culture Labs and Studio at Bentley. Liz has production credits for a 30-plus year career in the entertainment industry, including associate producer, production manager, editor, videographer, assistant camera, electric grip, and sound recordist for numerous production companies, and also served as former sales director for social issue documentary film distributor, Icarus Films. Thank you for joining us today, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. Well, welcome to the real upside down of Stranger Things, gender roles, and horror. I will just warn that if you have not watched season 1 and 2 of Stranger Things, you might do better in leaving and watch season 1 and 2 and come back and watch the recording. So I apologize in advance, but you have been warned. So I'm going to start this off with a quote. I can get this to go. Is it going to? There we go. Okay. The veil of shadows is a dimension that is a dark reflection or echo of our world. It is a place of decay and death, a plane out of phase, a place of monsters. It is right next to you, and you don't even see it. And this is spoken by the character of Dustin. So as expressed by the character of Dustin, where we learn about the upside down, the veil of shadows reference as the opposite to our world can be seen in direct correlation with the current work of feminism and gendered constructions and representations in our media. It is right next to you, and you don't even see it. It is something death-like and decayed, old and stale. It's a plane at a phase that refuses to keep pace with the real world in which we'd like it to be. It is synonymous with what Mike Bartlett stipulates in how nostalgia works in the series of Stranger Things, wherein this show, quote, simply wouldn't have existed in 1984. It manages to recreate 1980s television as we remember it, rather than it actually was, unquote. Stranger Things is the gayest, campiest, queerest, most feminist thing out at the moment, perhaps even in spite of its own intentions. It engages a feminist lens that magnifies sexism in all its forms and portrays female and genderqueer characters who resist in spite of the oppression that's bearing down on them from all angles, literally. This is quoted by Hannah McCann from Binary This. Stranger Things notably employs its nostalgic 80s referencing, but can be seen to point to issues of gender in the genres of horror and its sister genre, science fiction. As the quote by McCann illustrates, by presenting stereotypical characters from the time anew. It is also worth noting that these two genres are strongly the purview of and for boys and men. What comes under scrutiny, What comes under scrutiny in this 1980s referencing of American boyhood tales of adventure with science and the supernatural is a critique of the male action hero and the turn of men to the domestic space of the home, such as when the Byers household watches Mr. Mom together in season 2. Bartlett later states, quote, nostalgia matters because it brings meaning to our lives. The stories of our pasts become myths through which we attempt to explain the present, unquote. In presenting the past differently, in recontextualizing it, we may reflect on the present with renewed interest. One of the prevailing issues of the horror genre is that it does not usually present women as a major guiding force, leader, or hero in substantive ways. Helpless victim, virginal final girl, neglectful mother, or supernatural threat have generally embodied the characteristics that women have been cast to play in the genre. In response, many women film directors over the last few years, such as Lily Anna Amanpour's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, both released in 2014, have embraced such expectations by turning them on their head transforming new roles for women, in this case, vampires and mothers, that reimagine and rewrite their cultural positioning in the genre. This in turn then changes the dynamic for male characters in horror as well. Where this gender critique develops itself most astutely is in the Duffer Brothers' popular Netflix series, Stranger Things, and thus far has done so over 3 seasons. Reviews of the series after the airing of season 1 debated whether it is feminist at its core. At times, this is cited without an acknowledgement of how female characters were and still are systematically portrayed in horror as only essential to plot, usually without agency to truly call her own. Additionally, the series has been criticized for reinforcing tired gender tropes despite their normality in 1980s horror films. However, it has equally been hailed as redefining the single mother as hero, recodifying the virgin's role beyond her abstinence, and giving us what has been so egregiously absent from childhood tales of science fiction film, the young girl as integral and equal part of the boys' group. What is suggested in this analysis is to challenge the route through which female characters are notably read in this series, and to look at the ways in which male characters are presented alternatively. In other words, exploring crisis of boyhood, male teenager angst, and idealized manhood that had rarely been a factor of 80s pop culture implicitly disrupts the notion of masculinity in horror. This is achieved through a pattern displacing of some of its masculine roles with highly altered, nuanced, and multi-generational female ones. Therefore, it is argued that the Duffer Brothers did not set out to solely create strong female characters that would be at odds with their nostalgic referencing, but to enable a feminine lens to dislocate the causation and evolution of such staid feminine constructions in the first place. As a result, this approach provides more vulnerable and relatable male characters to be read anew. It is to see this shift in gender roles shatter the formulaic horror genre of the past as a means for its evolution moving forward, as it is truly a place of stranger things. To begin with, the larger question to be asked is this a groundbreaking approach and truly intentional on the part of the Duffer Brothers? Born in 1984, they are on record as having watched a lot of 80s films well after that decade. And it can be speculated that because they experienced these references as detached from the time culturally, they have a different perspective because of their distance. The men, women, and boys and girls presented in their ongoing story are all fashioned stereotypes to some degree, but a change of perception is imposed. When these characters conform or deviate from their 80s milieu, can we not consider them as being set up for critique? There is an adherence to not only look at women in their roles or men in theirs as some isolating event. What is proposed here is to take both into account as direct corollaries. It is not enough to just see strong female characters when the time period does not dictate it, but to provide a revisionism to that time period through the present and realize that perhaps not as much has changed as we would like to think. If we can see societal roles for both men and women shift in tandem, then progress can be made on screen. Perhaps the Duffer Brothers being far enough removed allows them to utilize 80s nostalgia in ways those of us who grew up in that decade, like me, could not, and it serves them well as a sign of strength. The same could be said for the inherent gendered constructs of the films of that time and how those influences have infiltrated the Stranger Things narrative. The Duffer Brothers present us with characters that challenge heteronormative ideals by subtly subverting their conformity and existing social constructs. This is exemplified in the opening scene in chapter 6, The Monster, while Nancy is trapped in the Upside Down as Jonathan searches for her in the real world. They both scream to each other in their respective realms, but cannot find each other. Both iterate that I'm right here, but they cannot comprehend they are on separate planes of existence that parallels their own separate world. Michael Kimmel writes in Manhood in America that, quote, manhood was replaced gradually by the term masculinity, which referred to a set of behavioral traits and attitudes that were contrasted now with a new opposite, femininity. Masculinity was something that had to be constantly demonstrated, lest the man be undone by a perception of being too feminine, unquote. In the Name of the Father, a discussion of new fatherhood, its assumptions and obstacles, Anna Maskelyne states that, quote, female roles were largely defined in opposition to the male ones, So changes in one must necessarily affect changes in the other. If true gender equality is to be achieved, it was necessary to reform not only female, but also male gender roles, unquote. She also cites Nancy Dowd that says, quote, masculinity as well as femininity is a social construct instead of a biologically essentialist characteristic. And as such, it is susceptible to change, unquote. Therefore, if we look at the male characters presented to us with some scrutiny, then we can determine how the series achieves the feminine, subverting the masculine in crises, as a means with which to see these as constructs, as fluid and open to change. In Spectacular Bodies, Gender, Genre, and the Action Cinema, Yvonne Tasker writes that, quote, the new man and the action man are complexly interrelated. It is important to appreciate that the 1980s redefinition of the action man hero also responds to feminism in complex ways and not just a part of a backlash. This redefinition is explored most extensively with the character of Chief Hopper. In the premiere episode, Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers, Hopper is seen waking in his disheveled home, drinking Schlitz beer in order to take his medicine, and smoking while brushing his teeth, giving the appearance that he is a bachelor at first glance and one who does not take care of himself. He then dons his police uniform, where a series of shots shows portions of his body, seemingly requesting to be dissected. The holster and gun at his hip, the delicate placing of his badge on his shirt, and the patiently waiting Indiana Jones-like fedora on the hook for his retrieval. He encompasses the authority figure of the narrative who provides cringeworthy jokes about sleeping with his coworker's wife, yet he still oozes the impression that he will be the hero of this tale. The masculine crisis that stems from this opening scene is that we later learn at the end of the season that his daughter died and he was unable to save her. His inability to properly grieve for his daughter, as seen when he either lies about his daughter being alive to Mr. Clark or when he claims his daughter won a spelling bee, is his quintessential crisis, where showing his grief might look like a sign of weakness. Flashbacks of his daughter Sarah's struggle with illness and death are interspersed with the searching for and finding of Will in the Upside Down, which creates a desperate desire for redemption on his part. Joyce, Will's mother, is the one who clarifies for Hopper that there is a difference between grief and denial, when she does not want to believe that Will is dead. When Hopper learned she was right about Will and that the dead body found in the quarry was not her son, he also learned she was right about the difference between grief and denial that kept him from truly mourning his daughter. It is why his search for Will unfolds in direct parallel to his daughter's illness and death. By extracting Will from the group of boys he had been also so closely associated, this then signals a shift in seeing this group quite differently as well. The young boys of the series, Dustin, Lucas, Mike, and Will, also hold a unique place in the development of narrative masculinity. Mike appears to be the central to the group and the one most inclined to help Eleven once she becomes an inadvertent part of it. But the most substantial one of the group is Will, as he becomes displaced by Eleven when he is taken to the Upside Down and she escapes from Hawkins' lab around the same time. His death and body are faked, but his real body is eventually used as nothing more than a host by the Demogorgon and is later possessed by the Shadow Monster in season 2. Will, in effect, has no will. Thanks to Eleven, she is able to find him at Castle Byers in the Upside Down and comforts him that help is coming. At the opening of Stranger Things 2, Will is heavily monitored by the Hawkins lab staff, much in the way Eleven is in season 1. He becomes known as the zombie boy by his peers, and Hopper agrees to the assessment that Will's condition is one of trauma and withdrawal. The boys, teenagers, and men of Stranger Things seem to struggle with not only putting forth an idealized and external male persona to the world, but all appear to have a crisis not of their own making, where they have little or no control in finding a resolution on their own. They require a female character to set them back onto the right path. We are also provided a further refinement of this masculinity in crisis that is shown in Extreme, where hegemonic masculinity is exemplified by the Demogorgon itself, as being described as a man with no face. This notion is then further expanded with the introduction of the extreme persona of Billy Hargrove in Stranger Things 2. Billy embodies the idealized but severely toxic masculinity that encompassed many action and teen romance films of the 80s. But here he is surprisingly objectified by the high school girls who check out his tight-fitting jeans when he arrives at school in his bitchin' Camaro. And Mike's mother, Karen Wheeler, does the same when he stops by her house while searching for his sister. It is evident that he is a product of an abusive father, and we get a rare glimpse into why Billy is the way he is. He mimics the same toxic behavior as the prior Hawkins High School alpha male, Steve Harrington from season 1, who he is trying to overthrow. He also seems pained by the split of his family and resents his sister Max and her mother in them being his new family. Although it might be simple to just label Billy as a bully or villain, since monstrous humans are made and not born. But in this case, his plight stems directly from a crisis of family and issues of fatherhood. Certainly, masculinity and identity are connected to and explored through fatherhood, even in the horror genre, but here they are presented as definitive crises. Judith Franco in her work, The More You Look, the Less You Really Know, The Redemption of White Masculinity in Contemporary American and French Cinema, implies that, quote, middle-class masculinity as a damaging social construction inflicted on the innocent white male, whose body becomes a site of performance that is emptied out of meaning and this identity, whereby this ends up placing emphasis on the family as the site of wider social crisis, unquote. If the family is deemed in crisis, then the blame is on the father. Billy's father is abusive. Mike's father is oblivious. Jonathan and Will's father chooses to disengage and is selfish. Lucas's father gives his son advice that men are always wrong, and Dustin's father is thus far absent from the series. In Stranger Things 2, the once popular Steve loses his girlfriend Nancy to the more reserved and bullied Jonathan, all the while enduring the wrath of Billy as his competition. But Steve finds comfort in his new role in displaying his paternal instincts once he befriends Dustin, where fans on social media had begun to affectionately refer to Steve's character as simply Dad. The father figures that we are left to examine involve Hopper, but now include Bob, Joyce's new boyfriend in season 2, not coincidentally played by Sean Astin, best known for his role as Mikey from 1985's The Goonies. Bob is positioned as the extreme opposite to Hopper. When Hopper takes on the mantle of father figure to Eleven, he shirks his responsibility on Halloween when he forgets he made plans with her because his job as an authority figure takes precedence. When she defies his rules and escapes the cabin to look for Mike, they get into a heated argument whereby she equates his actions as no better than Papa's. Bob, by comparison, tries so hard to be a father figure that had been missing in the Byers' home, yet he overdoes everything. When demagogues have surrounded many of them back at the Hawkins lab, Bob's working knowledge of BASIC, a computer language that became very popular in the 80s, is what is required to get the building out of lockdown. He offers to travel to the basement to achieve this and to be the hero for Joyce, but he is also the one to give Will some rather bad advice about confronting one's nightmares. And in the end, he is the one that is sacrificed as the proverbial stereotype that must be eliminated. No one is more problematic than Dr. Brenner as a father figure. It appears he acquired Eleven by deceitful means, made her do awful things to get what he wanted, but still had the need to have her call him Papa. Although he gets his comeuppance as the mad scientist who is punished by his own creation for trying to control the mind and body of the female. And this is namely Terry, Eleven's mother, Callie, Eleven's so-called sister, and Eleven herself. Brenner provides an extreme dissection of fatherhood that is in name only, but where some extremes exist, there is always an equalizing force setting things to balance. This is what I refer to as the masculinity-femininity bridge, and certain characters help the viewer toggle between those balancing forces. The masculinity-femininity bridge most involves Karen Wheeler. She is the ultimate nuclear family mom who bakes everything, tells her children repeatedly that I'm here for you, and takes charge when her husband won't. This bridge also includes Lonnie, Joyce's ex-husband, who represents the stereotypical, abusive, self-serving, absent father who claims to know what is best, but has no idea what he should in fact be doing for his children. Joyce continually argues with him when he does not show up or tells him what he doesn't know about his children. These are not characters in extreme crisis per se, but they certainly have their fair share of struggle when represented as a stereotype that is too obviously ripe for criticism, while being surrounded by more subtle revisions of other characters and their stereotypical ways. They help serve as a means to see other characters around them differently by using stereotype to fight stereotype. Karen's depth of character allows Nancy to be promiscuous as well as nerdy, and it motivates her to be everything her mother is not. As much as Lonnie serves as catalyst for Jonathan, as he takes on the role of father figure to his brother Will during numerous flashbacks, where Lonnie clearly disappoints his sons. This is further emphasized by the use of the clashes, should I stay or should I go, begging us to consider answering this critique of definitive stereotypes with staying or going. This is further exemplified by 11, who transcends gender prescription and confinement by being seen as both male and female throughout the series, in essence, as something other. Writing for the Chicago Tribune, Shelby Lynn Bostet writes, quote, without the burden of being raised as a girl, with the judgment and pressure that all young girls face while growing up, 11 wasn't bound by having to be a certain way or align herself with any notions of girlhood. 11 fights against gender stereotypes without even knowing that she is. She's never told that she's considered less, and so she never is less, unquote. 11, later to be known as Jane, obviously presents one of the most interesting characters in horror for a multitude of reasons. She is initially mistaken for a boy with her buzz-cut hair. She's named as a number, and there's little to deny the lack of identity in that. Mike shortens her name to L, thus labeling 11 with a gender in order to make her more accessible to others. When the boys costume her as a girl in a dress that once belonged to Nancy and fashion a wig to cover her more masculine hair, they literally make her into a girl. But 11 keeps the knee-high boy socks, later discards the soon-to-be ill-fitting wig, and finds her dress to be stained with blood and dirt. She still looks like a boy, but is disguised as a girl. When she is alone by a lake and screams while peering at her reflection, she isn't sure who she really is. The scream ripples the water, seemingly to erase her, but it can be inferred that for her, it is now about not adhering to any male's idealized notion of gender. Donald Collins in Pop Matters writes that, quote, Stranger Things also reconjures another familiar theme, our enduring fixation with American boyhood, unquote. But he adds, quote, it's worth pointing out that this is the work of feminism, to recognize, challenge, and dismantle toxic gender roles and barriers, unquote. The boys return to playing Dungeons and Dragons and to their fantasy at the end of season 1, but 11 lives it for real. In season 2, in the episode entitled The Lost Sister, almost a full hour of screen time is devoted to 11 learning of Callie, her sister from Brenner's lab, through a mind meld with her mother. Using only a photograph, 11 is able to locate Callie in Illinois. Many fans of Stranger Things seem the most dissatisfied with this episode because it takes the story away from Hawkins while equally focusing on almost an entire soul journey of 11 extracted from those she has been so intrinsically tied. However, this episode is the most crucial juncture for 11 to truly find herself. It is Callie who gets her to channel the true magnitude of her powers by using her anger as a focus of what had been done to her by Papa. The inclusion of imagery of Dr. Brenner in this episode is quite horrifying, as Callie makes 11's mind see him in order to make her point that they should kill all former employees of Hawkins' lab in retaliation. But 11's decision to not kill Brenner's assistant Ray, because it is discovered he has children and is a father, and block Callie from doing the same, makes her realize who comprises her true family. Despite being isolated from Mike and everyone else for a year in Stranger Things 2, 11 understands that she wants to return to Hawkins now and help her real family now, despite her journey with Callie. But where 11 is figuring out things without prior context, Nancy is fighting numerous imposing gender constructs on her own. Nancy is probably the most notable female to evolve over time, Having started as the smart, nerdy girl who yearns to be with the popular boy and who most seemingly adheres to the pervasive stereotype of the 80s teenage virginal girl, likely embodied by the iconic director John Hughes. In contrast, her best friend Barb, who is also seemingly virtuous and nerdy, is taken to the upside down by the Demogorgon at the precise moment in which Nancy engages in sex with Steve. The parallel cutting between Nancy's amorous lovemaking scene with the violent trauma of the taking of Barb serves two purposes. On the one hand, Nancy succeeds where her teenage predecessors do not, and she engages in sexual activity and lives another day. Barb, however, meets her fate by specifically not engaging with the teenage party antics at Steve's house, and it is in direct violation of the rule in horror that says the whore, and not the virgin, must suffer and die first. By juxtaposing Nancy and Barb, the Duffer Brothers put forth a critique about the other criteria involved with the virgin trope, that she be beautiful yet industrious, while serving in stark contrast to the sexy or willing to engage in sex whore, so that her purity as the final girl is left intact. On social media, fans were outraged by the death of Barb, using such hashtags as justice for Barb, simply because she did not deserve to die. Nancy, on the other hand, embodies some of the qualities of the whore trope simply because she has a known desire and acts upon it. But Nancy can be seen in tackling the mantle of whore and virgin, reclaiming both female desire and purity as something she controls and is not dictated by others. Nancy initiates the investigation into Barb's disappearance, and at every turn spurs either Jonathan or Steve to take action when called for. Nancy seeks out Jonathan to go monster hunting and later convinces him to help kill it. In rewriting the narrative that surrounds the feminine tropes of horror, Stranger Things presents us with former constructs colliding into new ways of having it evolve in the future. It is Nancy's idea to go after the Demogorgon, despite being told by others repeatedly about who she is. This is not you, as said by Barb, and you're a girl pretending to be someone she's not, as spoken by Jonathan. Nancy wants to overcome most female ideals of what a young lady should be, particularly in that she does not want to be like her mother. What drives her isn't her relationship with Steve any longer, once her desire to find Barb becomes crucial to her well-being, and her fierce motivation to brave the threat of the monster. Nancy also serves as a role model in the teenage set to the younger female middle schoolers, in that she provides a counterbalance to their male counterparts. In Stranger Things 2, Mad Max / Maxine also presents an interesting displacement for Eleven in the boys group. The boys are continually at odds over whether to include Max, while she must contend with her brother Billy's abusive nature. Like Eleven, Max takes on masculine qualities such as her name and bests Dustin in the game of Dig Dug. The video game is also precisely what the shadow monster does for real. It digs underground, causing instability and crises, even massive decay of the farmer's pumpkins, as the upside down penetrates its opposing natural world as was at what lies beneath. Because of the upside down's more direct association with Max, and thus the female, it can be seen as disrupting and subverting the normality of Hawkins, including its masculinity. Not only does Max take the persona of Mike Myers during Halloween, she takes the name Max and the subsequent moniker of Mad Max, alluding to the 1979 George Miller film, whereby the poster copy claims the story is about the maximum force of the future. This is best exemplified by ending where we started, parenthood and the perils of being positioned as mother in the horror genre. Motherhood, like fatherhood, is nothing new for these genres, but two particular women take on the mantle despite the odds, and despite the labeling of being called crazy by many in the town of Hawkins. As the first is not surprising that Terry Ives, 11/Jane's mother, watches Family Feud, but has been rendered essentially mute by Brenner. But she finds a way to communicate with Jane to let her know about Callie and to learn what really happened at Hawkins' lab in the past. Joyce, on the other hand, is the extreme opposite of Terry, seemingly annotating, usually while crying, or verbalizing everything that is going on around her, particularly when she is distraught over Will's disappearance. As a single mother, she is also fierce in her convictions and assured in her intuition. Casey Quinlan from Think Progress focuses on the underestimated representation of maternal strength that can be found in Stranger Things, since, quote, arguing for their own well-being is considered selfish, and where Joyce believes in her own intelligence and instincts to the point of stubbornness in a way that is common for male characters, but still uncommon for female ones, unquote. These women, particularly 11, Nancy, and Joyce, do have narrative agency, but not in the way we'd like to think or think it should unfold. It is seen in relation to the men around them, but the inverse is just as true. This is also a narrative that is reliant on an ensemble cast. Michael Sindel writes in Pace magazine about all of the female characters are problematic in that they, quote, the show relies on 11 to be understood through her relationships with male characters, unquote. But that is precisely the point. She must be understood in relation to the masculinity as much as to femininity. To present her in a way that deviates from the nostalgia of media of the 1980s would do a disservice to her. That is not how things were, but nor are they also different now. So it is suggested that Stranger Things presents us with a path in which to decipher these problematics by placing events in the past. It distances us to a degree, but puts the stereotypes on display for critique. In writing about these three women, Linny Krall in Exo Jane states that, quote, the existence of these three women in one season of television seems like a conscious effort at unseating gendered power, unquote. Women can be strong and make decisions. Mothers can be the glue who hold everything together. Men can cry over dead rabbits or a dying father and even be incapable of shooting a gun. Men can want to seek redemption by saving just one child, which is usually the purview of motherhood in this genre. The subversion of the masculine in crisis by the feminine equates these female representations, like the upside down that is also described as like home, but is obviously different. The same could be said for seeing stereotypes, particularly female representations, as being similar, somewhat different in ways, but equal. It is a reference and reflection of 1980s nostalgia and not the 80s themselves. It is how we'd like it to be, while now having some distance from that time. At the end of Stranger Things 2, the quiet resolution and coupling at the snowball school dance is subverted by the fact that the upside down still exists underneath. It remains a present danger, like our gendered issues in film and television, and it is not so easily solved in the span of a single series. To acknowledge this as unresolved, but presented as a challenge, Stranger Things provides the mechanism to have, at the least, a similar expectation with future tales of horror, one where women can be seen as strong in their own right, and where men can be seen as emotional and flawed. Like the veil of shadows, this notion is right next to you, and you can't even see it, but it's there. Stranger Things, as the veil of shadows continues to provide a piece of an evolution in dislocating these gender constructs as a place of stranger things, but one that could conceivably become the norm. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. All right, so we had a couple of pre-submitted questions. The one that I would like to ask you is about the using, let's see, I'll get the specific question was your thoughts on, is Stranger Things a time capsule? And do you think that those who are not familiar with the 80s view it that way?
Well, I can tell you that when I went to a conference after the first season of Stranger Things aired, there were a lot of people of my age trying to make sense of the fact that the Duffers were born in 1984, so they are far removed from it. And so their basis of understanding that time period is purely on media representation, purely on the films and television of that time. And so for me, I know personally while watching it, I felt like I was reliving I was 14 in 1984. And even down to like little details, like the necklace that Nancy wears with the ballerina slippers. I had that. I had a trapper keeper, stuff like that. And it just felt like you were reliving it. But I think because they weren't involved in that time, they could look at it very objectively. And I really do think that it was a form of strength to be able to do that. Like, I don't think I would have done justice if I made a TV series about the 1980s, having lived through it. But there is something to be said about looking at a lot of film and television from that time and being able to piece that decade together and then create something that takes place at that time, but in the present. And so we can't help but reflect, what we're seeing and what we know of the now, what we're seeing now, and then knowing this is a time of a that we may or not be attached to. So I do think the advantage of that is that, like, I know my children who are like 13 can happily enjoy it, and they don't really care about the 1980s referencing. That people who are maybe a few decades older may not also be attached to the 1980s, but still like find themselves identifying with the teenagers. And then people of my age who feel more like aligned with the adults and may have lived through that time, I think have a slightly different reading of it. So it's on the one hand, it's referencing it very, very directly. And on the other hand, I think it's also trying to recontextualizing it, maybe in the hopes of that the younger set might look at it a little bit differently as a way to move past, I think, some of the stereotypes. That would be my way of looking at it.
It definitely makes it fun to connect with the characters. Okay, the next question is, what do you think the gender role focus will be for season 4 if you had to take a hypothesis?
The one thing I find that's really interesting up until now is that there has been this resistance to have Hopper and Joyce couple. There's always this implicit, like, they're always together, but like it never really happens. And so I'm kind of hoping that it never does. Because there's something about keeping them separate that is working. Because I think that in this genre particularly, there's this need to automatically couple, particularly a female character, that you can't see her somehow in relation to anything other than another, a relationship of some kind. So my hope is that that actually continues in season 4. But I think the most interesting thing that people are wanting to know about 11, because she's lost her powers at the end of season 3, is the presumption that she'll probably get them back. And if so, what does that mean? And what exactly happened? And also her coupling with Mike. And one of the reasons why I think there's so much debate around her character is that she's immediately friended and coupled with Mike. But in the first and even second season, they're pretty much kept apart, and she doesn't have any basis to formulate gender constructs because she's been in the Hawkins lab for so long. But by season 3, she's like a giddy teenager. She's giggling with him. It's driving Hopper crazy, and so she's now catching up to all of that could impose what she thinks she's supposed to be in that relationship. So I'm kind of hoping they take that into a different direction. That the whole notion of coupling, I get it. It happens in almost every genre. But you don't necessarily see that in the action male genre of the 80s, not necessarily, or it's like it's part of it, like, in Die Hard or something, right? It's all about John McClane. He has a wife. He wants to get back to her. He wants to save her from the Nakatomi Plaza, but she's not really all that important. And so, but in this case, her relationship with Mike is very essential. So I'm sort of interested to know what may happen with that. But I'm pretty, if I had to put my finger on it, Hopper, I believe, is alive. And he's probably in Russia. And I'm also secretly hoping Dr. Brenner is also still secretly alive somehow, and also in Russia.
Hopefully we'll be able to enjoy it before 2022.
Yeah.
But I don't know where that will lie. And then in terms of other horror, either series or movies lately, are there others that you feel like also do a good job of kind of turning the gender roles around?
Yes. And I would see some of them go past the notion of gender, but also into race. I've heard at least 3 different radio interviews in the last week of everybody looking at Black horror, and in particular, even just starting with, even it could go farther back, but starting with Jordan Peele's Get Out. That there's almost a reclaiming for women as well. It's why I mentioned the Babadook and A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, but also for talking about issues of race, and having a director like Jordan Peele have a film that is precisely about the issues of racism head on, and making it about this nightmare, and at the same time making us identify with and want Chris to get out of that house, right? And so it's almost like this genre has been about minimizing minority characters, female characters, and then having directors take that genre back and reclaim it for themselves, and then put it forth as a different way of sort of contextualizing the genre is definitely, I've definitely seen a rise in it, and I hope it continues. I mean, we'll see what happens, but I think there's this need to do that, and it seems like the perfect genre to do that, because we have a basis of looking at past films or television shows. So much horror particularly references prior horror, and so we can look at all of that anew, and it's a really clever way to get us to sort of rethink a lot of those stereotypes.
Great point. Thank you. And I'll end with one last question. What will you watch as a quintessential show or movie for Halloween?
I'm debating this because I'm trying to get my kids to do a watch party. And I think they've seen just about everything. But I know that like certain scary things are for them a little hard to take. But I might recommend to them, like I do like the Conjuring films and the Insidious franchise, but I also like to comment while we watch it to say, oh look, there's the typical hysterical nobody believes mother, pointing to that, but she's right all along. And here's the father who doesn't believe her and disengages with the family dynamic, and so, you know, we might, and I say, but you know, it's kind of fun, right? There's something fun about just being scared and not necessarily totally analyzing the heck out of it while you're watching it. But I'll probably try to watch something with that. And we'll see. They did watch The Haunting of Bly Manor already. But I do know there's a new series out on Amazon on Friday called The Truth Seekers, which is with Nick Frost and Simon Pegg, and it's about, you know, they're internet like repair guys, but like they're also paranormal investigators.
Oh, it's kind of like Ghostbusters,
right? It's sort of like a British Ghostbusters, I guess. So we might just go that route, because I don't, you know, I know that the super scary stuff might be a little too much, or it might be just weird. I've never done it as a watch party before, so I don't know. Maybe it won't feel as scary.
if you're that joint experience. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We so appreciate your time this afternoon, and we hope everybody enjoyed, and have a very happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.